Right. Good morning, everyone. Uh, we're going to pick up where we left off in chapter 8, see what we can get through today. I think our last slide last week was slide 4, where we were talking about voting registration. Is that correct? Um, okay. Well, we'll start there and talk about registration um, in general, and then we'll talk a little bit about Texas registration. So. Registration process, the voting registration process is um, what we see each state involving, getting involved in to ensure that they know who is eligible to vote and who isn't. So each state sets those eligibility requirements within the state. There are, of course, federal uh, bits that come in as well. And so those will take those into account, right? So um, our history, right, in the United States has been one of essentially slowly moving from uh, just a few folks at the beginning at the beginning of the U.S. government being able to vote, white freed property males of the age of 21, I guess. Um, and if we look at it right through, uh, right, Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? 1920 amendment that brought in women to voting, right? And the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act in the early 60s, right? We've been consistently trying to address the problem of who can vote and how it is that people are allowed to vote and what steps they have to go through to meet the voting criteria of both the federal government and the states. And we've used, especially in the South, right? We've used the registration process as a way to try to limit who can be eligible to vote, right? We've used poll taxes where you had to be able to pay a tax to be able to get into the polls and vote. We've used literacy test where you had to take an exam to prove that you were literate. And keep in mind that um, these were barriers that were put into place to try to keep, especially in the 1860s and such, free black men from being able to vote who had just gained the right to vote. And so the folks that were running these registration processes in the states were uh, trying to use them as barriers to vote to prevent voting. And then the history is that of slowly overcoming those, right? And trying to make sure that everyone that has the right to vote gets the opportunity to vote. Voter registration today um, is still being used as a barrier to voting, right? Most of it is a barrier of convenience and opportunity. Uh, we've had in the last uh, 15 years here in Texas legislation that has been put into place under the arguments that was going to um, bring up the strength of our our ability to ensure that the folks that are voting are properly voting, that they are eligible to vote, trying to ensure the integrity of the elections. Um, and the law that was put into place in Texas was the Voter ID Act, which meant that you had to have an ID with a photo on it that was issued by the state to be able to vote in Texas. And that singular ID was to be issued by um, Department of Motor Vehicles. On the face of it, that's not a problem. And one, it certainly is useful to have one uh, identification that works for everyone. One, so it makes the process simple and straightforward. The problem with it is the implementation of it ignored some of the challenges in place to get that ID. And the biggest challenge, or the most, I guess, most prominent challenge in that scenario where we started requiring that photo ID issued by the state was you had to, and this makes sense, you had to establish that you were a U.S. citizen and a resident in Texas, right? All of the things that you're going to have to do of the right age to be able to vote, not a felon, right? These are all Texas. Um, but the problem with that is that the requirement that someone is be able to demonstrate their residency is not as clear cut as one would think. Um, for those that have been born in the 70s and 80s and going forward, the problem is 1970s and 80s. The problem is not that pronounced because we have in place a practice of hospitals issuing birth certificates, and it is the norm to issue birth certificates. But we didn't start in Texas really issuing birth certificates until I think it was the early 50s, 1950s, and so you actually have a good number of people still alive who were born before uh, birth certificates were a thing, right? So the requirement that you bring your birth certificate to establish your U.S. citizenship um, makes it difficult for those folks who don't have one to try to get one. And it's going to be very difficult without those uh, birth certificates issued by the hospitals to establish where you were born. Prior to that, right, your family might have recorded those themselves, but there wasn't any law, there wasn't any requirement that you have a birth certificate issued. Uh, Even today, there's the possibility that folks, if they are born at home and their parents fail to get them a birth certificate, it may be a difficult process later on for them to establish their citizenship. Um, and so there are things that weren't properly thought through when we put the voter ID law in place here in Texas. That ID law was challenged in the courts, found to be unconstitutional. The state legislature retooled it and has since tried to come up with other ways to allow that to happen. Um, but just the point is that that there are still challenges to how we do these things um, even today, right? And I'm not asserting that the legislature was trying to keep anybody from voting, but the law that went into effect had that property to it for some folks. Um, and even if you had the birth certificate, there were probably for some people economic challenges to get to a DMV, to the Department of Public Safety office. It did cost money, so it wasn't free, right? So you had to, you know, if you were working a job that required you to clock in and clock out, right, you're losing money to do that. If you don't have a driver's license, you're going to have to take public transportation, right? That's going to set you back time and money. So there were still barriers. There were still things that people were having to overcome just to get the right identification to be able to vote. And those kinds of economic challenges, those kinds of paperwork challenges, um, tend to fall on lower socioeconomic classes in the states, and so it seems unfair that they would have to do more work to be able to vote than other folks do. Right? They'd have to overcome more barriers, take more time, cost them money, that might be important. So those were some of the issues that were overlooked by the legislature and that serve as a challenge to these types of legislation. It's like it sounds simple. Hey, just everybody get a state ID and you'll be good to go. And all right, that's true, but it's not always as easy as people think it's going to be for everybody. So here is this slide that you're looking at now is actually the voter registration law for Texas. And so you have to initially, right, either register in person or by mail, which means you have to get a voter registration card. You cannot register online, I don't believe, unless that's changed just recently, and I don't think it has. Um, and so you have to fill out a card, right? You have to tell them who you are, where you live, and that should demonstrate, right, your citizenship and all that. The registration part that demonstrates your residency is very important. Um, to the state, they need to know where you live. Um, most most importantly, so that they can ensure when you show up to the polls that you get a ballot that is accurate for the area you live in, right? Because a lot of the positions you'll be eligible to vote for, the folks running for office will be geographically bounded, right? They'll be in a district, either a state senate district or a state house district, right? A judicial district or precinct, something like that. And so where you live is important and determines the ballot that you receive when you go into the polls. And so that has to be worked out ahead of time, right? The state needs to get that information, set that up, put you into the system and identify, what county you're in, what city you're in, what school district you're in, what uh, precinct of the county you're in, right? All of these special districts that you might be voting on, they have to figure out if where you live qualifies you to vote in which election. So it is an important process, right? And it is something the state needs to be able to work through. You're allowed at any time to get registered to vote. Um, you need to, if you intend to take part in an upcoming election, you need to make sure you're registered more than 30 days prior to that election. The state has 30 days to do their background work and set you up. And so if you wait till 15 or 20 days before an election to register, you're not going to get your your registration in place prior to that election. Uh, they'll move it through, and you'll be eligible for the next election, but you have to be ready 30 days prior to an election to vote in that. You have to be 18 uh, by election day to vote. Now we allow folks that are younger than 18, when you're 17 and a half, you can go ahead and register. So, if an election's coming up, you can have the time to get registered before the election and before your 18th birthday. So, so at 17 and a half, you can register. And then if the election occurs after your 18th birthday, you'll be registered and ready to go and be able to vote. You have to be a resident in your county and the state 30 days before an election, right? That ties back into the registration. And there is an impact on your ability to vote based on your status as a convicted felon or not. So um, if you're not a convicted felon, you're eligible to vote. If you are a convicted felon in Texas, then you will have to have finished your sentence, which means that you've taken care of all the things that the state has put as a requirement on you to, right, pay this back for the issue that you did for whatever crime you broke. Um, Sometimes that can be a difficult process to get uh, established as a voter with a felony conviction. Um, so in Texas, it's mainly a paperwork challenge. Once you get out, that you have to step through, you have to actually fill out a piece of paper requesting your right to vote back. and the state will then review all of that and say yes or no. Um, that process, in particular, varies from state to state. Some states, if you're a incarcerated felon, will actually bring ballots to you in prison so that you can vote. Some states simply require you to be out of prison. Some states require you to have completely finished um, your full sentence, which means not just be out of jail, but have done your parole or your paid any fines or anything like that. All of those things would have to be completed. Some, I think, still have the requirement that you write a petition to the governor of the state to get your voting rights back. So it varies. It varies from state to state. What how big the barrier for a felon is, convicted felon, to get back into voting. Um, there's this, the argument, the theoretical argument, right, that goes behind this is, on one side of folks are arguing that voting is a right and that nothing that you do should be removing that right from you, and that even if you are convicted and in jail for a felony, um, you're still going to be impacted by the votes by the of your representatives and by state law and by federal law, and therefore you still should be able to exercise your right to vote to determine who is making laws that might impact you. Other states have made the counter argument that, um, as a citizen in the state and the resident, I mean, a citizen of the United States and a resident of the state that you live in, you must follow the law, and that when you don't, you lose some of your rights. Um, and obviously, one of the rights is a right to be free and not incarcerated by the government. And states have argued that, hey, the right to vote is one that you should give up while you're in prison, and that maybe, right, you don't understand the value of the vote, or your demonstration of a lack of commitment to the laws is one that shouldn't allow you to play a part in determining who makes the laws or what the laws are. So their arguments are out there on both sides of this issue. Um, in Texas, if you're uh, in jail for being convicted of a felony, you will not be voting. And then you can take the processes on the back end to get that right back after you're out. Um, so I hope that right kind of gives you a good insight into uh, voting and registration and how it can be sometimes an issue. Um, so let's move on to voting turnout. So turnout is an issue both across the United States and as well as in Texas. And when we're talking about voting turnout, what we're talking about is the proportion of people who actually do vote, who actually do get involved and vote in the elections. And we talk a little bit about um, a voting eligible population. We talk about voting age population, um, right? And we compare the actual vote turnout to both of those. Who's eligible to vote? How big was that number? And how many people did vote? And how many were um, in the United States or in the state of Texas? How many people were eligible to vote, right? They're not a convicted felon. They're above the age of 18. They're registered properly and ready to go. How many people, right, did that number equal compared to the number of people that actually vote? And so, generally speaking, turnout in the United States is not great. Whoops. Um, it's even less in Texas, right? So, um, we'll look at some numbers here and give you an example of what's going on. So this is a comparison of the U.S. voting percentages compared to Texas voting percentages. It's broken into two perspectives here: what the voting percentages are, turnout percentages during presidential election years, and then the turnout percentages during um, off presidential election years when we're just voting on maybe the U.S. House or Texas State House. So if you look at it, right, we've got some. You can see that Texas consistently is below. Looking at the presidential elections, right, consistently votes at a lower rate than the nation as a whole. So we're already right behind the national average when we're looking at presidential elections. And the thing to know here about the presidential elections are those are the elections where the most people participate. This is our best case scenario, right? So if you look, you'll see when we have particularly contentious elections, it's a close presidential election, we'll be in the low 60s nationwide for our voting turnout, meaning out of all of the voting eligible folks, 60% or so show up to actually vote. Those numbers are typically going to be something around 160 million, 100 or so U.S. citizens voting. There's 330 to 40 million people in the United States. Of course, a lot of them uh, are not registered to vote or too young to vote or things like that. So the voting eligible population comes down uh, to about 240 million people out of the 340. So this 61% that we see in 2008 and the 57% in 2012, what we're looking at is about 160 million out of 240 million that could vote. Which, when you think about it, about 40% of the people that are eligible to vote don't. And so when you hear folks elected as president tell you that they've got a mandate of the people to do the things they promised during the elections, that's really a much smaller claim than they're trying to make it. What the numbers back up is that they have a majority of the 60% that voted. Most often that's going to be a 28 to 32% of the vote. Well, 40% of the people didn't vote. More people didn't vote usually than vote for whoever wins the presidency. So it's kind of sad when you look at it that way. It gets even more sad when you compare it to the off-year elections, right? When we're voting in Texas, right? This November is an off-year election, right? We don't have a president on the running for office. We do have a governor, and so, right, we put those governor's elections, particularly on these off years, to try to encourage more people to vote. But if you look at the numbers down there, you can see that Texas, when they're voting on very contentious governor's elections, right, or there's people are really participating, we get 35% of the vote. A lot of times we're down into high 20s and percent of the vote, right? So now the vote percentage drops for national average as well, right? So, but again, we're even if you look at 2010, right, 40% of the U.S. population participated in an off year election. Only 30% of Texas did. So we don't do very well, right, in comparison to the nation, and the nation doesn't do very well either in comparison to other countries. Now, one of the things to consider here is that the United States and the individual states, we do not have anything that acts as a mandatory kind of incentive to voting. Quite a few nations that have higher voting rates do so because they have a federal law requiring people to vote, or they schedule their elections on days that they can then declare as a federal holiday. And so people are not having to choose maybe between work and voting. And so, right, there's a lot of factors that go in to who turns out and why they turn out. And we could certainly make some progress in lowering those barriers to vote. Right. A national holiday on election days in November could probably help a lot, right? We could probably bump these numbers well up into the 70s if we just declared that no one worked on the day that we're having a federal election. The states that, or the countries that tend to do that also tend to uh, require that individuals be paid their daily wage, right? So they're not losing money on this national holiday when they go vote, right? They're getting a paid work day. And then if you don't vote, quite often the penalty, because it is a law, the penalty is that you will forfeit that day's pay because you didn't follow through and go vote. So there's some things that we could consider if we wanted to push voting participation to higher levels. Um, we've had these discussions at the national levels and the state levels, and quite often, one of the perspectives on it is it's not the job of the federal government or the state governments to force people or incent people to work. I mean, to vote. Um, that would just ensure that a lot of folks go vote who normally wouldn't and probably don't pay attention to elections. And their votes may or may not carry any value because they will not have done the work of figuring out who it is that they want to support them and why and what policy is important. They're just voting because they're required to. And there's a good argument to be made that um, votes mean more when the people casting them want to vote and have put effort into voting and know who their candidates are and the policies, right? I mean, and so when they are willing to do the work on their own and then meet the barriers to getting um, registered or meet the barriers necessary to cast the vote, that these are people actually demonstrating what they want, and they've probably put in some time and effort to figure it out. So it's not a clear-cut argument either way what we should do or shouldn't do to encourage more voting. From a political science perspective, uh, we obviously think that uh, people exercising their vote is important. Um, we think that a democracy is healthier that has more participation. And so it's a good thing to make this argument to try to make this happen. Now Texans, as you saw from the previous slide, participated even a lower level um, than the national average, and part of that is because, as we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, the demographics help demonstrate who's going to participate and why. We know, right, that the better educated you are, the higher socioeconomic class you're in, you're going to have more stake or have more of a perspective or of an idea that you need to meet the civic duty of being a good citizen, and you will vote. And that the lower you are on the socioeconomic scale, the lower you are on the education scale, the less you're going to participate. And when you look at Texas as a whole, we are a poor state. We are a state that has a good number of less educated folks. Um, so, right, you put those things together, lower education, lower socioeconomic status, um, also combine that with the fact that there are more minorities in those areas, we're going to have a lower turnout, and the turnout is going to be more skewed toward um, Anglo educated uh, and economically successful people. So all of these factors do impact our ability as a state to turn out well and vote at high levels. Um, and remember too, Daniel Elazar, right? We talked about at the beginning of the semester, uh, working through and designing these ideas about political culture for the states, right? Texas ends up as a state that is both individual and traditionalistic in its political culture. And both of those perspectives are ones that do not necessarily encourage the state to be involved in pushing participation, right? The traditionalistic perspective culture, political culture for Texans is that there are folks who are appropriate to be in government, discussing government, participating in government, and that if you're not a part of that class, then government is not really an appropriate place for you, right? Throw that in with the individualistic perspective, right, which would then also have us looking at, hey, it's not the state's job to encourage you to vote. If you want to impact what's going on in government and local, state, or elections, it's up to you to demonstrate that responsibility and learn what you need to learn, and then get up and exercise that vote. Right? It's not the state's job to encourage you there. It's your obligation as a citizen to do the work. So those two political cultures, as they mix together in Texas, both of them would tend to act as a deterrent or maybe a suppressant to voting, right? Or it's especially to a deterrent to the state taking a proactive uh, role in encouraging people to vote and helping people to vote. And so, in that sense, right, we're going to see Texans show up at the polls at a lower rate than the national average. Does this make sense? Thank you. I was looking for a little bit of verification there. So being a state that is on the lower end of political participation, um, knowing that the poor, the less educated, and minorities as a whole participate at lower levels, what you see as a result of that um, is that those groups not voting are basically handing the ability to control state government, control decision making over to the folks that do vote, which tend to be right the Anglos that are of higher socioeconomic status and higher educational status. Um, and so policy in Texas is driven by right conservative perspective, which the older Anglo folks belong to and espouse. And so um, as long as we have higher participation rates by Anglos and by the higher socioeconomic status and the uh, higher education stats, then we're probably going to stay a conservative state. Um, if lower socioeconomic status, if the poor, if the less educated, if the minorities in general in Texas begin to get motivated and begin to participate, um, then right Texas will become a purple state in the sense that we'll have a broader political perspective being represented in state and local governments. Um, if the minorities in Texas, right, the Hispanics and Asians and blacks who tend to support the Democratic Party start to show up at a higher rate, it'll make the Democratic Party a little more right competitive with the Republican Party, and we may see a difference there. Uh, that's a big if. It requires right people to get motivated, people to get registered, people to get involved in the system. Um, and of course, if you're on the lower economic uh, right end of the spectrum, right, it requires you to do all of this as you're trying to work hard to just make a living. And so the challenges are real, right? Challenges are real. Let me put up kind of a theoretical question to you. and ask, is it rational to vote? So this is a question that comes out of economic theory. Anytime in political science you see an appeal to rational acting as uh, how we're going to do something or who's going to get involved or something like that, what that's really asking is from an economic perspective, does it make sense economically to do whatever the action is we're discussing? In this case, that action is voting. And so to know if something is economically rational, you have to engage in a cost benefit analysis. You have to say, what is it my vote going to accomplish? What are the odds that it's going to make a difference? What is it going to cost me as an individual to cast that vote? And by cost here, we're talking about economic cost, informational cost, uh, burden, work burden, right, as a cost. Um, right, if you are working a job that is an hourly wage job and you have to take off 2, 3, or 4 hours to go vote, you're giving up the pay that you would have earned during that time. If you're trying to go vote and you've got children home and you need someone to look after them because you don't want to have them, that's going to cost you, right, to get a babysitter to look after that. How far are you going to have to drive? Do you have a driver's license? Can you drive? Are you going to have to get on a bus to go to the polls, right? Um, yeah, how much effort is it going to cost you on the front end to get registered, uh, to put in the time and effort to learn who the candidates are and what they stand for, and their policies? All of these things are costs that you pay as a voter, right? Whether it's a monetary payment or whether it's a payment in time and effort and understanding. There's a cost to getting well educated and well informed. Um, And then you should, right, if we're doing a cost benefit analysis, you'll also do an analysis on the benefits that you're going to get from voting. There may be direct policy benefits, right? That who you're voting for, if they get elected, may have positive impacts in policy that benefits you. Um, there may be um, right benefits that you feel that you get from participating, right? Sorry, didn't mean to switch that on you. Right, if you feel an obligation to participate in the election process when you do participate, you may feel that you benefited from that. You played your part. You did what you're supposed to. You feel good about that. All of those kinds of feelings are benefits, right? That you need to take into account. And at the end of the day, you'll right look at the scales here and look at the cost of voting and the benefits of voting. And from an economic analysis, if the costs outweigh the benefits, then it's irrational to vote. Doesn't mean that you won't vote or that you don't want to vote or anything like that. It just means that, right, if the costs exceed the benefits, then the rational action is to not vote. If the benefits exceed the cost, then the rational action is to vote. And for a lot of us, right, when we do this kind of analysis, and we've surveyed people about this and how they think about it and why it's important to them or whatever, and quite often, uh, the result is that it is irrational to vote. That the cost of voting are higher probably than the direct benefits that we can find from voting. And in that case, right, economic theory tells you don't do this. Um, if it's not rational, you shouldn't engage in it. Uh, Political scientists will tell you maybe you want to ignore that and vote anyway, right? Maybe on this cost benefit analysis, it doesn't show that you ought to vote, but um, one of the things that you may not be able or to calculate or to consider is the healthiness of the democracy as a whole and how democracy benefits from higher participation rates and better informed citizens. And so this cost benefit analysis is done on generally an individualistic perspective, and voting as a whole can be a much bigger project than just how we measure it for the individual. Um, some other things that will come into play about whether you vote or not will be determined by uh, if it's you have a high level of political trust or a high level of political efficacy, or vice versa. Um, those are important things, and we're going to talk about those because um, what you believe about the system and what you believe about yourself can have major impact on a lot of things. Um, what I have in front of you now is a list of 7 different modes of political participation, right? So you're doing this cost analysis about whether you should vote. Um, but there's actually a lot more out there for you in the political participation arena than just voting. Voting is, for most of us, really the cheapest political act that we can engage in, right? The one that's easiest um, for us, right? We on the most simple scale, right? All you have to do to vote is get registered, show up, and vote. Um, maybe you consider the cost, maybe you don't. But we have other modes of political participation as well outside of voting that we should be considering and thinking about. And we'll move through each of these. They're not hard to understand. They are in a particular order on this slide. They move from the least costly act to probably the most costly act of political participation. So voting, right? There is a cost. There are barriers, and some of those can be rather important to us or make an impact on us. And so, but voting is at the bottom of the scale here. Um, Second level of political participation is one that would require you to engage with politicians, to call them up, to send them an email, to write them a letter, to step outside of just I'm going to vote every 2 years or 4 years to I'm going to reach out to my politicians, make contact, and tell them what I want, what I think, and what I want them to do. And that requires you to do a bit more work to set yourself up on that. You have to be a little more committed to be reaching out and trying to communicate with your politicians. Uh, on the next step up on the political participation scale here is to be communicating about politics. And this goes beyond just reaching out to the folks that represent you. This is being more engaged in the whole political process, talking to your friends and family, right? Talking about what's in the news and what the government's doing, and having conversations or debate maybe with your friends and family about what's going on in the world and what your part is to play in that. Um, that takes a little more effort on your part to be engaged, to be informed, to be reaching out, putting yourself out publicly, right? Uh, and communicating with other people. The next step up on the scale is to actually get involved in political campaigns. And this could be volunteering your time to a local candidate that you support, working for, identifying with and working for a political party, um, making campaign donations, actually putting money into the process, right? All of this are steps that are going to require you to go beyond, right, voting and go beyond uh, writing letters to your politicians and go beyond just talking to your friends and family, right? Once you get into the campaign aspects and you're actively supporting a party or a candidate, um, that's a good bit of commitment on your part, right, to be involved in this process. Um, One step up from that is what we refer to as a community activist. A community activist is someone who is probably doing all of these things that we've mentioned below, or above, I mean, voting, contacting, communicating, and campaigning, but they also see themselves and project themselves in their community as someone that's going to be working on behalf of their community, someone that will move around their community, talk to people in their community, try to get a feel for what the community as a whole thinks, translate that feeling and that perspective and that ideology to the into the political system and into candidates. And um, a lot of folks that go on to become politicians start off as some form of community activist or um, getting involved and representing their community and participating in their community. Again, this is a step up. This is even more effort than getting involved in a campaign, probably. The next step up on the participation scale here is to become engaged in protest. And protesting here, it's a broad activity. There are actually three types of protest that you can engage in. And so I want to take a little bit here and talk about those three elements of protesting. Um, at the easiest level of protesting is the protesting that we say saw last weekend with the No Kings protest, where there's coordination and people show up. Someone has filed for a permit to have a legal protest at a particular area at a particular time in a particular place. Um, and the key here is that this kind of demonstration is legal, right? Follows all of the elements to be a legal protest, right? People just legally exercising their First Amendment rights to assemble, to ask redress of the government, to look for change, right? To tell people what they think. That's the base level type of protest. Second type of protest that we see in American history is civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a very specific type of protest. And the idea here for anyone that engages in civil disobedience is they are going to be engaging in illegal activity, right? The focus of civil disobedience is to demonstrate and participate, but do that in a way that violates the law that you think is inappropriate. So civil disobedience is, right, intentionally demonstrating in a way that is illegal to try to bring reform to that act that has been deemed illegal. So if we go back to the civil rights here and we look at some of the civil disobedience that's going on there, right? We look at um, folks that, right, did not allow segregation to occur, that violated the laws on segregation in the South, people that refused to be prevented from having their voice heard and marching and trying to get folks registered to vote, right? There were laws in place that they were actively breaking. And the idea behind it is to bring attention to the inequity of this law that they're going to break, to demonstrate that it's unfair, but to also demonstrate that this law breaking that they're engaging in is not a contempt for law as a whole, right? People who engage in civil disobedience break the law and voluntarily accept the punishment for breaking that law, hoping that breaking the law and accepting the punishment will demonstrate the right injustice of the law, and paying the penalty is an unjust um, result from that law. They pay that penalty, though. They go to jail, whatever the penalty is, because they're also signaling that they believe in law, they believe in following the law, they believe in following good law. Um, and they believe that it's got to the point where, breaking the law and paying the penalty is the cost for bringing this unjust law down. And so when you look back to the civil rights era, especially, and you see these folks getting uh, breaking the law, marching when they didn't have a permit, when they were told they couldn't, marching anyway, to one, bring attention to the fact that voting wasn't happening and registration wasn't happening. There were barriers put into place, but also breaking the law that the local government has put into place. Then, right, not resisting arrest and going to jail and paying the penalty for breaking the law they broke is sending this message of, this is an unjust law. We need people to be aware of what's going on here, and we need people to recognize, um, we respect the law, but sometimes you have to take action against it if the government is not paying attention. So that's the second level of protesting, civil disobedience. Um, so it's technically illegal, but the point of that illegality is to change that law while paying the price for breaking the law. The third type of protest is illegal protest that does not have the caveats and the nuance of civil disobedience. It is folks who are breaking the law to certainly bring attention to the policy that they're advocating, or the policy they're trying to stop, or maybe the law that they want to get rid of. However, they're not intending to pay the cost, right? They're going to break the law and try to get away with it, right? And they're hoping that the disobedience, the protest, right, the law breaking is enough on its own, or that if they don't take these actions at that time and place, the thing that they're fighting for will disappear. And in this instance, what I'm thinking of and want to point out as an example would be environmental, um, illegal environmental protest. Say a company has legally attained a permit to uh, cut an old growth forest down, right? They've got a permit, they've paid to get it. The legal authority that has um, rights over that land has granted them a permit to come in and cut those logs. And environmentalists might be looking at that and going, hey, if you cut down an old growth forest, even if you replant, you're never going to get the same biome again. You're never going to get the same environment again. Once you cut down and destroy an old growth forest, it's not going to be an old growth forest again for generations, right? And even if it is, it won't be the same as the one that you cut down. So from that perspective, right, especially when you're looking at protecting the environment, the damage is such that you need to stop the act, and you'll stop it with any kind of action that you need to engage in. Well, and quite often with the environmental thing, we'll see folks that will climb up the trees and just live in the trees. And so, right, the companies that have permits are not going to cut the trees down and kill these people. So it preserves that forest. And, quite often it gets a lot of media attention, and that's what they're looking for. And they're hoping that all of that will generate an environment that will make it non-profitable to cut these trees down. Uh, other instances of say environmental protests that fall in this area, where you'll see um, protesters break in and destroy property of timber companies. Right? Um, they'll destroy their tractors and their mechanical stuff that they're using. Right? And that's, as you know, you're destroying somebody's property, very illegal. If they get caught, they'll go to jail. But the end point that they're looking at is to try again to make it too costly for these companies to engage in that activity. That's right, just straight up illegal. It is protest, right? There is a political focus coming out of this. There's a push for political change. It is a voice that needs to be heard, right? But the way you're going about it is completely illegal. Um, and the government's going to be working on trying to, right, catch you and convict you and incarcerate you for breaking the law. Um, so those are your three types of protests: legal protests, civil disobedience, and straight up illegal protests. That fill out this protest perspective. The last one here is what we refer to as complete activist. There's no straight, strong definition for this, but it would be individuals who engage in all of these previous political participation modes, right? They do vote, they do contact, they do communicate and campaign. They work on behalf of their neighborhood, right? They do engage in protest. It would be all of these things. That would be somebody we refer to as a complete activist. And obviously, the effort being put in here is a very high effort, right? Um, okay, so the last thing I think this is, yeah, our last slide that I want to bring up here is uh, how we act politically and why we act politically. And this goes back to 2 slides ago when I mentioned uh, political trust and political efficacy. So if you look at this chart that is here, um, you we see that it's a 2 by 2 chart, right? We break political trust up into a level of high trust or low trust, efficacy into a high level of efficacy or low level of efficacy. Let me define these for you. So political trust is a trust in the government that they will do what they're supposed to do. So having a high level of political trust means that you expect the government to follow the law, to uh, be impacted by elections, to ensure that there are routine elections happening, and the people that are supposed to participate can participate, right? And you have a high level of political trust. You believe all those things will be the case. If you have a low level of political trust, right, that's a low level of trust that the government will do what it's supposed to do. Um, that it is not necessarily looking out for the best interest of everyone. Political efficacy is an inverse to political trust. It is not strictly an inverse, but it is a perspective of your ability to make an impact in politics. Do you have a high level? If you have a high level of political efficacy, you believe you can in politics make a difference. If you have a low level of political efficacy, you don't think that you as an individual can make much of a difference. And so when we combined these perspectives on whether we trust the government or not, and whether we believe in ourselves to make a difference or not, it tells us how we're going to act, right? And it gives us insight into why we're going to act that way. So let me start with a high level of political trust and a high level of political efficacy. So we're looking at this top left quadrant here. If you think the government will pay attention to voters and citizens and will act as it's supposed to when they're putting information into the system by voting or um, uh, getting involved in lobbying and negotiations and bargaining and as such, and you think that you're someone that can make a difference, right? You have a high level of political efficacy. You're going to engage in politics because you believe you can make a difference. And the fact that you have a high level of political trust means you're going to engage in the very conventional and legal modes of getting involved in politics because you believe the government will listen. You have a high level of political trust. So you think, I can make a difference and I'm going to engage in these acts where the government expects me to, and the government will respond to those, right? And so voting, right? All of those modes that we just talked about, contacting politicians, communicating, right? Engaging as a community activist, those types of things are the actions you will engage in because you expect the government to pay attention to those actions, and you think you'll be effective in those actions. So let's move down and let's look at having a high level of political trust, a low level of political efficacy. Again, your perspective is the government, the democracy is working the way it's supposed to and will respond to the inputs that people put into it. Now, your perspective is one of low political efficacy on yourself. You don't think you can make that big of a difference, but you do think the government will pay attention. You're probably, right, if you don't have a high confidence level in your ability to impact things, are not going to engage in political activities, political participation that require a lot of dedication and a lot of work because you don't think you can make a difference. So if you have low political efficacy but high political trust, you might vote, you might contact your politicians, send an email or something like that, and you might have discussions with your friends and neighbors about politics. It probably won't go any further than that, right? Because you just don't have the confidence in yourself to make a difference. Now let's move across to the bottom right quadrant here, where you have low political trust and low political efficacy. You can see the expected participation here is none. There is no participation. And I think that makes sense because if you don't think the government's listening to you or respond to you, and you don't think you can make a difference, why would you engage? Right? It's you'd be wasting your time because even if right you did these acts, voting or whatever, no one's going to pay attention to them. The government's looking a different direction. You're not something that they're going to cue into or cue off of. So folks with low political efficacy and no trust to little trust in the political system are probably alienated from the political system as a whole and will not engage. They might be guilted into voting occasionally, in a sense, because they still know that's our obligation, but they're not going to do it with any kind of perspective that it's going to have an impact. Now, the last quadrant, this top right quadrant, is the most interesting, right? These are folks that have a low level of political trust. In other words, they don't think the government's going to pay attention or respond to them in the ways that it should, but they have a high level of political efficacy. So they're going to take government by the scruff of the neck and they're going to shake it around a little bit and they're going to try to make it listen, right? Because they think they can. These are the types of folks that are going to get involved in politics, even if it's just to challenge the government as a whole. These are the folks that are going to engage in protest, right? Because they can make a difference, and their protest is going to be important, and it's going to catch the eyes of people. It's going to maybe convince the movement to grow, right, and people will follow them, right? Because they've got a high level of political efficacy. They think they can make a difference. They can shake the world a little bit. And eventually, right, they will get the government to either respond to them, right, or they will take over the government, right, in a sense. And folks like them will get involved and make a difference, and the government will start to respond because they made it respond. Does this make sense? These ideas here and why we would act and based upon our perspective on trust and efficacy, and then how we would act if we were going to, given this. I think this is a really good and easy kind of perspective on getting involved and making a difference. And so I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about that, or at least I presented this to you in a way that you could think about it some. So at this point, I think we have finished chapter 8, which means we have concluded the lecture bits that are going to be on the test this week. Right, so the upcoming exam covers chapters 4 through 8. And it will be, I think it comes live first thing, midnight on Thursday. And you'll have the window Thursday and Friday to take that test. Um, so I'm going to call this a very convenient place to stop. Um, we've still got a few minutes left in class. Uh, are there any questions that you want to ask me before we call it a day? Okay, I'm seeing none. So let's end the lecture for today, and I'll see you guys on. Okay, did get a quick question here. What should we focus on for the exam? Uh, so just like the first test, right? You're responsible for everything that's in the textbook, all of the lectures, um, right? All of that is eligible for the exam. Uh, again, right? I think if you will spend the time with your extra credit quizzes, that will help you prep for the exam a lot. Right? That is, again, what I consider to be a working version of a study guide. So um, you should make sure that you have worked your way through all of this material in the book. That you got good notes from these lectures. Remember, they're online. You can go back and look at them. Slides are there as well as the recordings. Um, and then all of that's eligible for the exam. Is that good? It is a lot of material. It is a long exam. I believe there are 90 questions on this exam. Um, you can't go back and look at the quizzes from the first unit, but you don't need to. I've moved quiz 4 into the current unit. Uh, up through Wednesday, right? The end of Wednesday, all of those quizzes are available to you as many times as you want to look at them. And chapter 4 is in unit 2, so you can still look at chapter 4. Anything else? Okay, well, let's call it a day, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday, and we'll start chapter 9. What we cover on Wednesday is not on the exam, right? It'll be on the next exam.